Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this introduction to the winners of the second SEL Assessment Design Challenge. Before we begin the program, I'll review just a few quick housekeeping items. We will be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and we'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation once all of the Design Challenge winners have presented their measures. Please send in your questions throughout the presentation, though. We'll go ahead and put those into a queue to be answered at the end. To send a question, you'll use the questions feature that's on your toolbar. Type your question into the top box, push send, and I will put your question, as I said, into the queue to be answered at the end of the webinar. Since we do have several speakers with us today, and we'll go ahead and take a look at those, when you do have a question and send it to me, if you could go ahead and identify who you'd like to have answer that question, that'd be really helpful. So we're sure to connect you with the right person to get your question answered. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides with you, so keep an eye on your email inbox tomorrow for details on how to access those materials. Now let's get started. Dr. Jeremy Taylor, Director of Assessment and Continuous Improvement for CASEL, is going to kick things off with some background on social and emotional competence assessment.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being on today. And the webinar today is focused, of course, on the winners of the second design challenge from a national assessment work group on social and emotional competence assessment. And this work group was really brought together because of the need that we have seen in the field for some information about assessment of these competencies. In a recent nationally representative sample principals that we surveyed, we saw that overwhelmingly there is support for social emotional learning. More than 99% of principals we spoke with reported that they thought these competencies were definitely teachable in their students and that they were committed to fostering them. But you can see the stark difference. Only about a third of the principals felt like they were clear what measures were currently available to assess these competencies. And even fewer felt like even if they did know that there was broad understanding in the field among their teachers about what they could do with these measures or how they could be effectively used. So this sort of need in the field really articulates the impetus for this work group coming together. And some of our co-presenters today, Clark McGowan and Noah Bookman, are fellow members of this work group. Other sort of important collaborators in the effort, in addition to CASEL and CORE, who Noah represents today, and XSEL Lab, who Clark represents today. We also have Stephanie Jones and her taxonomy project from Harvard University. Some folks, Brian Stetcher and Laura Hamilton from RAND, are collaborators on this work group. And Sarah Kirchman and Katie Buckley from Transforming Education are also key collaborators. In addition, on nearly 20 additional other researchers and practitioners from around the country are also sort of important members of this effort. And then before I turn it over to the important people on the call today, our speakers, I also want to take a quick moment to thank the funders of this effort. You see here, they're all members of the Funders Collaborative for Innovative Measurement. And in particular, thank you to the Kauffman Foundation, who especially is a supporter of this design challenge work that you're going to hear about today. And then finally, just to provide some context, I will give just a quick overview of the 4 overall goals on the next slide of the work group, and then go ahead and pass it on from there. And it looks like perhaps my screen is frozen, but that's okay. I'll just go through the work. So the 4 goals of the work group overall are: 1, to sort of coordinate and collaborate with the field broadly about SEL assessment. And this includes a collaborator network that has grown to more than 2,000 people. And you can sign up if you haven't already at measuringsel.org and join the collaborator network. A second main goal is to provide some guidance practitioners about how to use SEL frameworks. And there's going to be, starting this fall, a series of briefs coming out from September through December on how frameworks can be selected and used by practitioners. A third goal is around identifying currently available measures and how they can be effectively used. and that is going to take the form of a assessment guide that will be available, excitingly, at the end of next month in late September at launch. And then finally, the purpose for coming together today is our fourth goal, which is a focus on what it would look like to have practical performance measures of social and emotional learning competence, and what are some of the key design principles that we might look to see those increasingly developed and used in the field. So without further ado, I believe I'm going to pass it off next to Clark.
Actually, I think Noah is next.
That's precisely what I meant.
Yeah, well, good morning, everybody, or early afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. My name is Noah Bookman. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the core districts in California, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing this design challenge work with my colleague, Clark McGowan, who's going to talk in just a moment. Just want to give a quick overview of what the design challenge is about. This is our second year doing it. The idea was to get ideas and practices and assessments shared in a way that people can potentially start to use them or learn about them in terms of social emotional assessments, particularly those that use what we call direct assessment. That is, we're really trying to get at the direct skill and directly assessing the skill or the perspective or the aptitude that a particular social emotional skill is getting at. A lot of our social emotional measures can be indirect, things like surveys, and while we love surveys and some design options that certainly get at those pieces, we're also interested in a wider array of assessment options. So last year we did sort of an open call for assessments. This year we tightened the call a bit by having first reached out to our practitioner community to get the priorities of that community in terms of things that they want to see assessments for. And use that in order to cultivate this year's call for proposals. And we're very pleased to have the opportunity to hear from some of the winners today. But before we do that, my colleague Clark is going to share a little bit about some of the lessons learned around social emotional assessment that we've been able to cultivate through this process.
Thanks, Noah. Yep, my name is Clark McGowan, and as Noah mentioned, we are co-chairs of this design challenge portion of the assessment work group that Jeremy described a moment ago. And what I'd like to do is just briefly describe what some of the lessons are that we've learned from 2 years worth of design challenge. Really, as Noah mentioned, our goal was to identify and shine a spotlight on innovative ideas for how to directly assess the kinds of social emotional skills that educators and policymakers and parents and others are increasingly recognizing as important for success in school and in life. And this year, we solicited input from practitioners first to ask them what their most pressing social emotional assessment needs were. And then we asked for submissions of design concepts that were really tailored at specifically meeting one or more of the identified needs from the practice community. And from that, we developed a couple of new design principles that basically we added to the list of design principles that we had developed last year. And these are principles that basically say what the sort of optimal elements of a useful social emotional learning assessment would be. And so let me just tell you what some of the principles are. From last year, and all this should sound fairly obvious actually, but these are nevertheless cornerstone elements of good design. One piece is that any good SEL assessment ought to demonstrate usability and feasibility in authentic educational settings. So it's got to be something that can actually be used by real educators within the constraints and within the constraints that an educational setting provides. Assessments ought to be designed with a clarity of purpose. No one assessment can do everything. It can't be all things to all people. So the best assessments will declare what they are and what they are not, what they're good for and what they're not good for from the outset. We also believe that the best assessments, particularly because the span of our constituent, it runs from 5 years old to 18 years old, needs to be developmentally appropriate, and because our constituents, children in K-12 education in the U.S., are from incredibly diverse backgrounds, the best assessments will pay close attention to the cultural appropriateness of the content and to the technical properties of the assessments that ensure the equivalence of the scores from one group to another. Fourth, data reports ought to be easily understood and ought to be tailored to addressing the specific information needs of educators who use the assessment. Fifth, and this is related to the first design principle, any good SEL assessment that's really going to have a broad impact ought to be feasibly and easily used by entire districts. So not just one specialist administering a test one-on-one to a particular child, but something that can be scalably administered to everybody. And sixth, the assessments ought to exhibit good technical qualities, reliability, validity, etc. Now, to those principles that we sort of extracted from our assessments in the first design challenge, we've added three that were really lessons learned from this year. One is that we think that assessments that are really the best and going to be most useful to practitioners are those that will provide opportunities for students to demonstrate their social emotional competencies in response to performance challenges that they encounter in the real world. So this means that simulations or stimuli that actually look like the skills that kids need and look like the sort of situations and challenges that they face are going to be the most compelling to educators and probably provide the most useful information. Second, we are now convinced, as if we weren't before, but we really are more convinced than ever that involving practitioners in the process of assessment development are really going to strengthen the products of those efforts, because even the smartest test developer can't fully anticipate the needs of the practice community and the realities of practitioners who will be using the assessments. So from the moment that a designer wants to create an assessment, they'd be well advised to get the input of practitioners who they intend to be the users of those assessments, so that from the beginning, considerations of use and usefulness are baked into the design. And finally, we have focused in our assessment work group on direct assessments, but I will say that we were struck in the needs expressed by the practice community that direct assessment, yes, it's a very useful and necessary means of getting at social emotional skills, and it's probably, in my opinion, the least developed of the areas of social emotional assessment. However, it's not the only strategy that could meet some of the needs that educators are expressing for social emotional assessment. So I envision a future in which direct assessments paired up with other forms of assessment, different methods of ascertaining kids' social emotional skills, will provide a multi-method, multi-rater assessment of kids' social emotional skills that will really provide a rich picture of children's strengths and needs for the variety of assessment goals that educators are pursuing. So that is a quick summary of some of the design principles that we have come to feel are really important in creating the next generation of assessments, be they direct assessments or otherwise. And with that, let's get to the important part of the webinar and have the winners of the design competition tell us a little bit about what they're envisioning in terms of their assessments. And we're going to start with Dr. Ryan Kettler from Rutgers University. So Ryan, I'm going to hand the mic over to you at this point.
Thank you, Clark. I really appreciate it. And thank you also to the assessment work group for the opportunity to enter and win the award from the Design Challenge. It's been a great honor for both myself and also for my colleagues for whom I'm presenting here today. On the selected response assessment of socio-emotional competence, or the SEL, that's our design for a measure. And I've developed the design along with my wife, Kelly A. Feeney-Kettler from FK&K Consulting, and also Leah Bitzer from Concordia College in New York. As Clark mentioned, I'm from Rutgers University. I'm an associate professor in the school psychology program there. And the subtitle today, and really one of the two main reasons that we wanted to develop this RASEC, is distinguishing can't from won't. So we want to develop a direct measure of kids' knowledge so that we know that, for example, if Maria doesn't initiate new friendships with other kids, we can go a step further from doesn't to find out whether it's a matter of she won't initiate those new friendships, or if she can't initiate those new friendships. And that's what a direct measure of socio-emotional competence can do. A secondary reason that we wanted to develop this measure was to give socio-emotional competence a chance to be measured in a way that has the same accuracy and precision, the same validity evidence and reliability evidence that our psychoeducational measures, our measures of reading and mathematics, benefit from. And we wanted to do that in a selected response format. And I'll talk about that a little bit in just a minute. So if we could advance to the next slide. The selected response assessment of socio-emotional competence, or the SRASEC, is going to be developed and has been designed to be a measure of social, emotional, and behavioral knowledge. We really want to get both at those externalizing characteristics that are easier to witness and observe, and also those internalizing characteristics that are directed inward and are more difficult to observe. We want to be able to use the measure ultimately with kindergarten through 5th grade, because this is a time of great growth in this area, and also a time when those skills act as prerequisites to being able to learn in terms of reading and mathematics and other achievement-based skills. Our format is going to be scenario-based, selected response, and online. And so if you're not familiar with that term, selected response, you're probably familiar with what it means. It's just dichotomously scored items like multiple choice, true, false, matching, the types of things that we use to measure reading and mathematics. And so how will that convert to socio-emotional competence? Well, we're going to use our scenarios, and then we're going to connect items to them. So there might be a matching item with a scenario about a teacher giving news to various students, and the respondent will have to determine what feelings are likely generated by these different pieces of news. Or a multiple choice item connected to a scenario about a child being called a derogatory name on the playground, and what different steps or what would be appropriate responses to that in a multiple choice format. Our intended uses, we have several listed here, but they all stem from the first one, which is to measure socio-emotional competence and to measure it well to reflect those internalizing and externalizing strengths and competencies. And if we do that well, we'll be able to provide a profile of student strengths and weaknesses. We envision having at least subscales for internalizing and externalizing characteristics in order to cater selected and targeted interventions. So if we're thinking about it working within a response intervention or a multi-tiered system of supports, then we would be identifying preventive interventions at a group level, maybe even a classroom level, and also at an individual level as needed. We want this to be a measure that's precise enough to reflect change in socio-emotional competence. So not just to tell us where Tyrone stands in terms of his internalizing competencies, but also how he's changed going from fall to winter to spring. And then lastly, to allow those comparisons with academic variables and using a common framework so that, historically, when we've been measuring using direct observation or rating scales for socio-emotional competence, there's two reasons that makes that comparison difficult. One is it's different constructs. That's the intended reason. But there's also a difference in methodologies that hasn't been able to be disentangled. And so we want to use the same methodology to measure socio-emotional competence with this RASEC. Next slide, please. We're going to follow an organized design plan, heavily informed and influenced by the 12-step process by Lane and colleagues that's published in the Handbook for Test Development, which starts with an overall plan and determining exactly and defining which constructs are going to be measured, developing a large number of items for each of the constructs and sub-constructs to be measured, and then iteratively through expert review and through pilot testing, reducing those numbers of items. We're valuing multiple forms of reliability and validity evidence consistent with the AERA, APA, NCMA standards for educational and psychological testing, and also consistent with seminal works such as Messick's 1995 paper on how construct validity is overarching the other types of validity evidence, and Kane's 2013 writing and subsequent writing about how our validation plan should be informed by the intended uses of the measures and intended inferences from them. Specifically, in terms of reliability evidence, we're going to be measuring internal consistency. So how homogeneous are those subscales for internalizing and externalizing competencies? And also test retest stability, which is critical because we're going to be wanting to measure growth. And so we're going to want to know how much of that is error versus how much of that is actual change in socio-emotional competence. We'll collect several forms of validity evidence, including content evidence, using those expert reviews with panelists, including teachers, specialists like behaviorists, school psychologists, special educators, and also researchers in these areas. We're going to use cognitive labs to get response process evidence. So having children complete this RASEC and give us feedback on what they're thinking about when they're reading these various vignettes and scenarios. Internal structure evidence like confirmatory factor analysis to test our two-factor model. And relations to other variables. And I'm really looking forward to being able to collect data and use a multi-trait, multi-method framework with tests of reading and achievement, reading and mathematics achievement, and also the SRASEC as a measure, a test of socio-emotional competence, alongside rating scale measures of socio-emotional competence and reading and mathematics in order to verify that more of our magnitudes and correlations are being explained by a shared construct, socio-emotional competence, versus the variance being within measure, within type of measure across constructs. Next slide, please. We're developing this RASEC on a rich theoretical and research base, including a structured literature review that Kelly and I conducted with a couple of students last year, over 20 years of direct measures of socio-emotional competence. And we reviewed 66 measures over that period. Mainly the constructs that they measured were emotion recognition. So think of like infants and young ones identifying the looks on people's faces and the necessary emotions that would be connected. Emotional intelligence, so identifying one's own emotions and negotiating them and how to manage them and respond to them. And also social cognition, so going beyond to like different scenarios with persons other than oneself and how emotions could interact and how to act socially. The main formats were vignettes, pictures, short answer, performance tasks, and also some essays. But very little selected response or multiple choice with this type of measure, or true false, the types of formats that we're going to use on this RASEC. So we're really breaking new ground by using this type of format. We've been influenced by existing formats for socio-emotional learning, including the 5 core competencies identified by Castle, and also 15 related constructs identified in McGowan and Taylor's recent special issue of the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology. We're also going through different state standards in terms of what socio-emotional constructs are being emphasized in various states. Next slide, please. We plan to have a thorough score report when we're completed with the measure that's going to give information on group and individual levels that can be used then for those both secondary and tertiary levels of intervention. So we're not just talking about the individual, but we're also talking about the group and perhaps the classroom or the district level. We're going to include total and subscale scores, again, for at least internalizing and externalizing. Scores are going to be raw or at an interval level and also categorical to give an idea of what an average range is, below and above average ranges, and also high and low ranges in terms of knowledge of these skills. We're going to give reports in terms of current status and also growth and trend or change. We don't want to just know what the socio-emotional competence is, but how much it's growing in response to teaching. We're going to provide textual and graphic output to make it easier to understand where the areas to address are. And we intend for the measure to be able to be used formatively and summatively, so to make changes during a school year and to improve instruction on a group and individual level, and also to evaluate at the end of the school year how individuals, classrooms, districts, and schools are performing. But the ultimate goal, again, is to distinguish those can't situations from those won't situations, which is something that rating scales and also direct observations, I think, have difficulty doing within that format. Next slide, please. So our next steps in terms of developing this RASEC are to follow the design that we've laid out. We're deciding on those final content areas within internalizing and externalizing and doing the review that I mentioned before. In order to do that, we're going to develop a large pool of items, have multiple rounds of expert review, and eventually do pilot testing. So if anybody there listening today is working in a school or has connections with schools that might want to be involved with pilot testing for a measure like this, I would love to hear from you back channel. I'd really appreciate that. And I know my time is up. My email address is there if you want to contact me. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ryan. And we'll just leave that email up for just a second. This was great to hear what your plans are, and hopefully we'll get some recruits from the audience. And just as a reminder to folks, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint slide. So if you don't have a chance to write down Ryan's email address, you will get it by email. So next up, we are going to hear from Miguel Rivera with Democracy Prep Public Schools.
Yeah, great. Awesome. I hope everybody can hear me. I forgot to check in earlier to make sure that people could hear me on my headset. But yeah.
You're sounding great.
Great. Awesome. I always worry with these types of things. Our technology still hasn't gotten to a place where I can fully rely on these types of webinars. Cool. So yeah, I'll just get started. Like the slide says, my name is Miguel Rivera. I'm at Democracy Prep Public Schools. But I also wanted to introduce somebody else who is not going to be speaking with me today because she is likely dealing with some situations within schools. But this sort of entire proposal came together from myself and Sharice Main, who is Director of Scholar Support at Democracy Prep. And honestly, the way that Sharice and I operate is just we often get into a room together and we just start talking about things, and then we usually sort of don't follow any sort of path, and we start talking really high level, and then eventually we get to a really cool idea that takes us a very long time to implement. So that's sort of how this our proposal came together for this as well. I stumbled upon this competition a few weeks before the deadline, and I met with Sharice and I was like, hey, what do you think about this? And so we went off for a while. For about a week and a half, I would say we were developing something that actually did not meet any of the criteria for this assessment, and then we came back and we were like, shoot, we need to do something else. So eventually we came up with this idea to create a sort of game that could give schools insight into how students are sort of internalizing their social emotional competencies. But before I get into that, next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit more context of where this is coming from, Democracy Prep Public Schools is a charter operator of K-12 schools across different states. And we share some similar philosophies with some other charter schools, those being like students spending more time at school, using data thoughtfully throughout schools, and so on. A few of the things that set us apart from other charter schools are that we sort of emphasize civics education, sort of hence the name Democracy Prep. And we do everything via public funds. For anything related to sort of the K-12 education space, we do through public funds. And again, just to give you an idea of who we are, our mission is to educate responsible citizen scholars for success in the college of their choice in a life of active citizenship. And again, civics and soft skills and just social emotional learning is deeply rooted in what we do. And we sort of recognize that it takes more than academics to get students to be successful. And so that's sort of where we're coming from, or the headspace that Sharice and I were in when we were developing this thing. Next slide, please. So I sort of talked about this vague thing that we were doing, and so I'll talk a little bit more of the specifics now. So basically, the problem that we wanted to tackle was, every school has a set of core values that they sort of want to instill among their students. For Democracy Prep, we have the DREAM values, and the DREAM stands for discipline, respect, enthusiasm, accountability, and maturity. And other schools have some other, some similar set of values that they try to track. They might have some of the same adjectives. They might be a little different, but usually every school has something that they want to prioritize. And there are ways in which schools can currently sort of determine if their students are internalizing these values, if they're living them, if they're translating them from the school classroom to their home life. And some of them are, you'll see here in this slide. I think one of the primary ways that this is done are via tracking sort of behaviors or deductions or demerits via some sort of token economy system, via Dean's List, which is what we use at Democracy Prep, or some other systems might be that people might be familiar with, are Kickboard and Class Dojo. And again, that basically requires for somebody to go in at the beginning of the year and determine, all right, we want to know if a kid is talking back or sleeping in class or is being unresponsive, and you'll tag those manually to one of your core values. And then at the end of the day, week, year, you can sort of determine how individual kids are doing based off the deductions and demerits and things that they've gotten. Another way you can do this, which would be sort of represented by all the other different buttons on the slide, are by using, by pretty much developing your own scope and sequence of different ed tech platforms that you want to use to measure different things. So for example, you could in one day go to StoryCorps to sort of assess or instill empathy in your students. You can go over to Stop It to provide students with an avenue to report bullying and things like that to sort of raise accountability. And then there's something like the Harry Potter Alliance, which are just generally to promote civics education and just a general sort of teamwork and friendship among students. But again, this would require schools to be very knowledgeable of the existing edtech platforms and just develop an entire framework for how they want to measure this and study this and test this throughout the year, which most schools just generally don't have the time to do. It becomes very cumbersome. Lastly, schools might opt to do something along the lines of just general forms that either the teachers fill out via their observation on students, or students fill out based off of their own sort of interpretation of how they feel they're doing. Sometimes this is just entirely school built via some sort of form technology. Sometimes they use some frameworks that are existing to sort of guide their questions and guide their thinking. And so this is sort of the space where we started off and the problem we wanted to tackle. Basically, we wanted to come up with a way that would allow schools to track the things that are important to them, sort of unique to each school. For Democracy Prep, it would be the dream values. For somebody else, it might be the build curriculum or some other set of values, while also sort of minimizing lost instructional time and not putting too much work on school staff, because at the end of the day, we do want people in schools to be teaching students. That's sort of we know that that's just what we wanted to do, and to raise student ability. Well, we also wanted to find a sort of simple way to give teachers and staff just actionable data. And so with that, next slide, please, is where we came up with this idea of, all right, what if we developed a little game that was sort of like one of those text-based sort of survival games that you might have played on your mobile device or in the past in general, where basically a student is confronted with several different scenarios and they have to make a choice between some predetermined actions, and then based on those actions, it'll lead them to other scenarios. So in that way, it would be sort of adaptive to students' responses, and it would give you an idea of the values that they're sort of internalizing and prioritizing, and you can determine how well those align with your school values, and you can use it for goal setting purposes and things like that. So sort of unlike some of the other presenters today, we are still very much in the process of even thinking through what this might look like. So I don't have very concrete things to share with you. So I was just going to talk you through what we were thinking in terms of what we're going to do, what we want to do, and what our plan is for the rest of this year and the coming years. So again, the idea of this is to present students with scenarios, and the sort of really exciting part for us is we want it to be sort of culturally relevant and developmentally appropriate for all students. So with that, our plan is to sort of curate scenarios from existing alumni, students, and staff, and using Sharice's sort of expertise as Director of Scholar Support just to review those scenarios and see if they are actually measuring what we want them to measure, along with the predetermined actions that the students might take. But with that, we also want to be able to pull in some of the existing data that we have on the students. So for example, this was originally built with high schoolers in mind. So for example, a 9th grade student taking the game assessment in the beginning of the year will start off very fresh. Maybe they'll be asked to select what classes they want to take, guiding them through their high school career, and then taking them into college, asking them to decide which kind of college they want to go to, or what types of majors they're interested in. But for somebody like an 11th grader whom we presumably have a lot more information on, we have their past academics. If we're collecting sort of behavior, character, culture data, we'll have some information in terms of like how often they're late to school, how many times they get suspended and things like that. So we can incorporate some of that data via some sort of CSV imports to personalize the scenarios so that they are as realistic and relevant to those students as possible. And just based off of students' decisions, they'll accumulate points throughout the game, and the different scenarios and the different decisions will be tagged just to different values. So it'll be sort of customizable to each school. Likely we'll end up with a bank of scenarios which schools will be able to tag to the values that are pertinent to them. And based off of a student's actions, they'll get points, and then by the end of the sort of game, we'll be able to get some good data on how a student is doing currently versus, as well as if we're assessing this throughout the year, we can get an idea of just changes in students' perceptions and values. Next slide, please. So this again, it's very much a sort of work in progress. Still just thinking through what we might want to do with this. But here I just wanted to give you an idea of some ways that we thought that this game tool, I even struggle to categorize it because we're not exactly sure how it'll be used or anything like that. But this is just an idea of how we imagine the data impacting sort of interactions between staff and scholars. So one of the ways that we thought this could be useful was just after a student finishes the game, they can be presented with something like you'll see on the top right, basically a radar graph of where they are in terms of their values, either some sort of alignment score or just some sort of raw number of where they are based off of the points that they've accrued throughout the game, as well as just a comparison to how they're doing relative to other students, probably in their grade band, just to make it as accurate of a comparison as possible. From there, sort of bundling up those numbers into student subgroups based off of, if students' disabilities or English language learners or just grade level groups. Staff can use them to set broader initiatives and can use them to set specific themes for town halls or things like that. Individual student responses to scenarios can be very useful for some scholar support team members to determine just like how students are dealing with certain scenarios or certain situations, or how certain scenarios might affect them in the future, just for guided conversations in that way. And then just either multiple throughout the years, if the game is assigned multiple times, or even if it's just assigned after discrete events throughout a student's career, you can just use it to determine year over year how things are changing within populations. Just because, as student populations change, just priorities change, values change. You can get an idea of both how well those students are aligned with your school values, as well as determine like how just what the incoming values are of students, just so you can sort of prepare teachers and help them anticipate what they might have to interact with in the future. Our intention with this was not at all, and I do want to say this very specifically, that the students shouldn't be necessarily graded on their scores or responses to these things. None of this should ever really show up on a report card. It really is meant to guide conversations and initiatives throughout the year. We don't want students to get in this sort of test-taking mentality when they're approached with this. And so as far as that goes, that's basically, next slide, please. That's pretty much what we had in mind when we were putting this together. Again, this was basically my coworker Shrees and I in a room, just talking very abstractly for several days before we were like, what if we built a game? And then we came up with this. So our goal for this coming year is we're probably going to be using the first half of the year to sort of build it out intentionally with one of our schools as a pilot, building out a scenario bank, making sure that the sort of actions or the responses to the scenarios are giving us the information that we want, and also just making sure that the interface of this game is intuitive and is useful for students. And then in the latter half of the year, we'll probably put it in front of students or some subset of students so we can not only just make sure that it works for the students, but we can start working on the associated TD that'll go with this, because the goal really is for the students to play the game, and then for staff to get some sort of scores, and then from those scores we want to come up with a plan that they can use to either have conversations with students or develop some sort of initiatives or things like that. So I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if I wasn't actually keeping track of the time very well, but I'll leave it there. If there are any questions, we'll get to them at the end. But again, this is very much a work in progress, so I'm very interested to hear any thoughts that anybody might have.
Great, thank you, Miguel. Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities with what you've brainstormed here, and I think you've got a good path forward. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, and we'll be excited to hear hopefully some follow-up in the future as to how it goes.
Yeah.
So our final speaker today is Ashley Carls, and she is with Rush University Medical Center, and so we will hear about what she and her team have come up with.
Hi, so my name is Ashley Carls, and I'm a research coordinator working under Dr. Nicole Russo-Ponceron at Rush Neuro Behavioral Center. Dr. Ponceron is actually on maternity leave as of yesterday, so I will be presenting here on her behalf. Next slide, please. So our research department at Rush Neuro Behavioral Center, just to give you an overview, focuses primarily on the development of social emotional learning assessments and interventions, as well as exploring the underlying mechanisms related to those skills. So for the design challenge this year, we submitted our assessment VSIP, or a Virtual Environment for Social Information Processing. Next slide. So VSIP is a validated, web-based social reasoning or social problem-solving assessment for children in grades 3 through 7. It utilizes gaming technology to create a virtual environment that students can interact with and navigate through while encountering challenging social situations. So we based VSIP on the Crick and Dodge social information processing model, which breaks down social problem-solving into steps. So in this diagram here, we have them laid out sort of sequentially, but in reality, people often jump around between these steps instead of following a linear path like this. The processing steps outlined in the model include identifying a social challenge, responding emotionally to the situation, deciding whether and to what degree others are behaving with hostile intent, choosing goals for resolving the problem, selecting a solution to achieve those goals, and deciding how confident the person is in their ability to carry out their preferred solution. VSIP was designed with assessment areas that mirror these steps. Okay, next slide. VSIP began with the goal of developing a social reasoning assessment that more closely paralleled what children actually do in real time with increased ecological validity. So we had previously conducted semi-structured interviews with children, and we often had parents reporting back that while it was great that their child knew the right answer, it wasn't what was actually happening on the playground. So we wanted to create a direct performance-based assessment to capture how children really think and feel in these situations, and to give them an opportunity to report on these thoughts and feelings independently. We also wanted to make sure children were able to identify with the scenarios and relate to the characters. So to accomplish this, we allow children to have the ability to personalize an avatar character that they then use throughout the assessment. And they're also able to customize certain scenes by selecting preferred items, which are then incorporated into the scenarios. These features help them feel more invested in the experience, and they are able to identify more strongly with both their character and the situations themselves. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So adhering to the Crick and Dodge model of social information processing, the domains that VSIP measures include solution preference, problem identification, goal preference, emotion response, degree of hostile intent, and self-efficacy. Questions are asked within the assessment as part of the story by a peer character that accompanies the child's avatar through the program, which allows for a more seamless experience and also encourages more honest and accurate reporting. Next slide. The program has 10 scenarios that take place in various locations at school, including the cafeteria, the hallway, the classroom, the playground, and in front of the school. Social situations include ambiguous provocation, compromise, bullying, friendship initiation, and peer entry into a group. Children encounter 2 of each situational category and location throughout the program. Next slide. We designed VSIP with teachers in mind, so we really wanted something that was effective, easy to use, and minimize the administrative burden. The web-based and self-directed format allows for multiple classrooms to take VSIP simultaneously. We included a brief tutorial module to instruct children on what they will be doing and how to navigate the program, which means the program can be administered with minimal training. Scoring is also automated and available directly after completion. Next slide. Score reports can be generated at the student, classroom, school, and district levels. Reports show color-coded overviews of how students are doing, with green indicating average scores, yellow indicating scores 1.5 to 2 standard deviations below the mean, and red indicating scores lower than 2 standard deviations below the mean. When the cursor hovers over a result, the standard score appears for that subject. Users are also able to generate numeric reports of standard scores as well. Calculated scores include the domains we discussed earlier, as well as a social information processing composite score made up of solution preference, problem identification, and goal preference, as well as an emotional processing composite score made up of emotion response and degree of hostile intent. So at this time, scores can be calculated relative to district level data, and we are currently in the process of developing national norms for VSIP as part of a norming study, at which point standard scores can be calculated in relation to a national sample. So we're actually still accepting school partners across the country for this norming study, and those interested in participating in the study are able to utilize VSIP for free during this school year. So next slide. If you want to contact us for more information about our assessments at RMBC or our research, or how to get involved with the VSIP norming study, please do contact myself or someone from our research team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you again for stepping in for Nicole, and we wish her the best of luck with her new baby. So again, Ashley's information and her colleagues' information is up there, and feel free to reach out to them if you would like to participate in their pilot program moving forward this school year. And thank you again to Ryan and Miguel for sharing their measures as well. We do have some questions that have come in and can certainly accept some more. But before we get to the Q&A, I just want to thank again the collaborating partners and funders of the SEC Assessment Work Group. You can learn more about the work group at measuringsel.castle.org. And be sure to check out the site's blog. Each of our winners have contributed articles to the blog, so you can learn a little bit more about what they've talked about here today and get to know these assessments a little bit better. You'll also want to keep an eye on measuringsel.castle.org over the coming months, because there will be more information about the upcoming 2019 Design Challenge there as well, and how you can participate in that. So let's go ahead and get to the questions. Ryan, we'll start with you. How long do you anticipate the assessment taking for students, and how often do you think it would be beneficial to administer it?
Well, those are definitely good questions, and certainly not at the point where we have can give us certainty in terms of how long it would take to administer. I think that getting it somewhere in the 20 to 35-minute range is going to allow us to have the number of items that'll be necessary to get precision in terms of the constructs that we want to measure. So my sense is that that's probably where it's headed. And then in terms of how often to be able to measure, as an assessment that we'd be using formatively, I'm hoping that it would be a tool that we could administer at least 3 times a year in order to be able to track growth. So thinking of like a fall, winter, spring type administration.
Great, thank you for clarifying all that.
Sure.
And Miguel, you're up next. Obviously we know you're in the early stages of developing your measure, but you had mentioned, I think, getting student feedback to help create some of those scenarios. And we just had a question about what your plan is to enlist students' help and brainstorm those scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our first plan is to enlist the support of our alumni. We have a lot of students that have graduated from some of our high schools that are in college now, and they're usually very willing to help us out with these sorts of initiatives of ours. So I think our first step will be to just enlist their support, either via some form feedback or just having them come into the office to talk through what our plan is and see if we can brainstorm some scenarios. I think following that, we will try to get some scenarios from current students. For that part, we honestly haven't thought through too much about what we want to do. We might do some sort of interviews with the students, or we might just try to pull, we have a lot of historical data on things that have happened with the students, so we might try to pull from that bucket of information. But once we have those scenarios, we will definitely need to go through the scenarios and just make sure that they are sort of generalizable to other students, and that we can come up with appropriate sort of responses that students can take for each scenario. That we can, at the very end, in the beginning, we'll want to tag them with the values that are important to democracy reps. But after that, our plan is to have other schools be able to tag them with whatever they value. But yeah, right now, I think our goal will be to pull in from the support of our alumni.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Those are the people that you have the relationship with first. So, yes. Ashley, for the virtual environment for social information processing, someone is wondering if you've thought about doing something similar for teacher PD or training that would assess educators' ability to their social emotional competencies and ability to react in different scenarios.
That's a great question. We do not have any plans currently of developing that, but we do want to expand our coverage, in the future, and that is definitely something that we could consider.
And actually, we had a question very early on. I think that really applies to you, Ryan, and Mikkel as well, or they'd like input on your thoughts on assessing educators' social and emotional skills and helping them be able to better support students. Do you see any ways you could integrate that into your assessments?
So just to make sure, this is Ryan, that I understand what you're asking. You're talking about, for example, assessing the teacher's socio-emotional skills as part of the process?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and specifically, I'll just read this one sentence from the question. Educators need to feel comfortable modeling these skills throughout the day, so making sure they have them.
Right. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Was this also for me, you said, or?
Yeah, if you wanted to chime in, this was just a general question to the group, and Jeremy, if you had any thoughts as well, you're welcome to chime in.
I mean, at least for our case, I don't think that our intention is for staff themselves to use this sort of game that we're designing. I think it is going to be for scholars specifically, but I think part of the plan with this game tool assessment is to build in some sort of PD or some sort of training for staff when they're reviewing these results, which is where I'm honestly going to rely on the expertise of Sharice, our scholar support director, because obviously she's has a lot more familiarity with just training staff on these sorts of things. But I think part of the purpose will be and part of the pilot this year will be figuring out the best ways to do the trainings with staff in terms of interpreting the scores and how we can come up with specific actions that staff and schools can take to either address some misalignment between students and staff, or sort of calibrate some specific responses of groups of students. Yeah, our goal is not to have staff take the game, at least not that I'm aware of right now, but to have some sort of training for them in reviewing and interpreting and understanding the results.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I thanks for a couple minutes to think about that issue and formulate my response. I feel the same way as what Miguel was expressing. I don't see this RASEC, because it'll be written with kindergarten through 5th grade scenarios, I don't see it as being meaningful for measuring educators' knowledge in that area. I do work in my profession in terms of teacher evaluation, and I am a proponent of teachers being evaluated more broadly than simply based on growth and achievement scores for students. And so I do think that teachers should be evaluated and receive professional development feedback on professionalism and issues in sort of that area as part of their overall growth. And so I do think that that's an important thing to bring up, probably not something that would be directly measured using this RASEC.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's definitely a need for those types of assessments, and certainly for then professional development for educators. But this design challenge was focused more on the students and their skills. So thank you all for answering. Ashley, a question for you. I believe you mentioned that the assessment period was about 30 minutes. Within that 30 minutes, how many scenarios do the students encounter?
So they encounter, after the tutorial module, they encounter 10 different scenes, and then they get a little break in the middle after 5 to change the outfit of their avatar and kind of, then go into the second day, quote unquote, of the experience. So overall, it's 10 scenarios.
Okay. I love that they get to change the avatar. I think that's a great feature.
Fun.
Yeah. And how often are you envisioning the assessment being administered throughout the year?
So we, as part of the norming study, I think we're hoping on, to do sort of a test retest, exploration there. But we, right now, we don't envision any more than 2 times a year. So schools will typically either administer it once a year, or they'll administer it sort of at the beginning of the school year and at the end of the school year to kind of track that growth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Ryan, how are the scenarios presented in your assessments?
Well, we're planning on having online computer-based scenarios, so either pictures with voiceover reading them, or maybe more of like virtual reality if we can get to that point in terms of programming. We're open, depending on what route we end up taking to develop the measure, we're open to having more of a paper and pencil easel-based piloting to get to the right items and stuff like that. As a stepping stone, if that's required, before we can have it online.
Yes, and yeah, just as a reminder to everyone, these are all in development and early or earlier stages for some than others, but definitely lots of great work showcased here. And as I said earlier, we'll be really excited to see where these go and what use they can be in with practitioners. So thank you all again for sharing everything. We have run out of time, and so I apologize for the questions that we did not get to, but hope that this session was informative for everyone. Just as a reminder, we will be sending out that email tomorrow with a link to the PowerPoint slides and to the recording, so you'll be able to share this with colleagues or reference it back yourself. Also, when you log off of the webinar today, you will be prompted to take a really short survey. It'll only take you just less than a minute to answer the questions, and we'd really appreciate your taking the time to do that to help us make sure that we're providing content and information that's valuable to your work. So please take that when you log off today. Thank you again to Ryan, Miguel, and Ashley for joining us, and thank you to everyone who supports the work group, and be sure to check out measuringSEL.castle.org for more information. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.